Hello everyone, welcome, you made it. Today we are looking at the Shakespeare authorship question, which is more than another conspiracy theory and important not just for Shakespeare and his plays, but as we will see, for art generally. Now, I have made a PowerPoint presentation with about 35 slides or so, and which have various details which I won't read through in detail, but which will be up on the screen. So if you are just listening, that's fine, though sometimes I will assume you have the detail from the slides. So, while the plays themselves are about 400 years old, this authorship question wasn't really raised until about 200 years later, when the plays, or works as I will call them, started to be analysed in detail, and which pretty soon afterwards raised the authorship question. And in 1920, John Thomas Looney, who was a teacher, published his book Shakespeare Identified, which is what we are looking at today. Now, before we go further, I'll just note that to be a Stratfordian is to support the official view that William Shakespeare was the author. Shakespeare was from Stratford. And to be Oxfordian is to support the theory put forward by Thomas Looney. That's the intro. Now, in terms of the question being asked and whether there is really an issue as to the authorship of the works, here we have Charles Dickens, who was speaking generally about what we know about Shakespeare, which is very little. Here, Dickens wasn't speaking about the authorship question per se, but just the general notion that we know nothing about the author, really. Mark Twain, however, spoke directly to the authorship question. The quote up on the screen is from his 1909 work, Is Shakespeare Dead? As far as Mark Twain was concerned, there is no evidence that Shakespeare wrote the works attributed to him. What we have essentially is a body of works with no author. Yes, we know his name, when he was born, a few business deals, a court case, his last will and testament, and when he died. But in terms of a substantive author, a person, their creator, the works are an orphan. Moreover, this orphan status is not just because we know so little of the author, but also, and this is the official uncontroversial position, the author abandoned his works. Shakespeare stopped writing, went back to selling grain and buying real estate, and let others finish and publish most of his works. Now, to set the stage, what's the scene? The period we are looking at spans from about 1550 to 1623. We can start with the accession of Queen Elizabeth in 1558, which corresponds with the start of the age of English literature, and specifically John Lyly, born in 1553, described as the true inventor and introducer of dramatic style and the chief master of Shakespeare. There is no play before Lyly. He wrote 8. And immediately thereafter, England produced some hundreds. That's from R. Warwick Bond, The Complete Works of John Lyly, published in 1902. In 1557, Songs and Sonnets by the Earl of Surrey was published, which was the only work of its kind. Nearly 20 years later, in 1576, the first Shakespearean sonnet had been written, Love Thy Choice. Now, before I go further when looking at these types of works, remember we have stage plays, secondly verse and poetry, and thirdly literary plays. First come the stage plays, the bare telling of a story. Separate to that is poetry and verse, or songs, and then literary plays, which versify the text of the stage plays and enhance their depth and presentation. Today we are looking at the poems and literary plays attributed to William Shakespeare. From 1580, the dawn was at hand for English literature and poetry. That's per Dean Church in Life of Spencer. And then also in that decade, we have the trial and execution of Mary Queen of Scots, and of course, the Spanish Armada. Now, at about this time, 1580, the dawn, the population of London was about 100,000. And 20 years later, in 1600, it had about doubled to 200,000. England in total was just over 2 million. The nobility, very relevant for Shakespeare, consisted of 1 marquess, 18 earls, 2 viscounts, 37 barons, and of course, one monarch. So much for the scene. So where do the works fit in? Well, right about 1590, just after the Spanish Armada. Now, we have no manuscripts, no works from Shakespeare's own pen, but what the record tells us is that in about 1590, Shakespeare started writing his sonnets, 14-line poems in a particular pattern. The first 17 sonnets are known as the Procreation Sonnets, urging a young nobleman to marry and have children. They go on to lament the author's age and the loss of his good name. The author speaks of himself as a man living under a cloud of disrepute which he didn't deserve. Excuse me. 1590 is when these start to be written, and by the end there were 154 sonnets in total. The poem Venus and Adonis, published in 1593, was the first work that referred to Shakespeare, although technically not as the author. There is no mention of Shakespeare on the cover page. Instead, on the second page, so not so much the cover page, I suppose, you can call that a cover page, I guess. Anyway, instead, on the second page is a dedication to the Earl of Southampton, which I have set out there on the slide. Such dedications generally meant an existing connection, but it was also the cultured speech of the poem itself which showed a familiarity with the nobility. Now, this is his first work, coming in at 199 6-line stanzas, published as a standalone work and dedicated to a specific noble, the Earl of Southampton. So, out of the blue, he arrives. No short poems or earlier collections, just this, Venus and Adonis. And the conventional official position is that Shakespeare was a poet before he was a dramatist, but of his first steps in the practice of poetry, nothing is known. From nowhere, Shakespeare simply bursts onto the scene. After that, we then have another poem, Lucrece, or The Rape of Lucrece, and dramas and comedies being performed. And then a flood of literary plays are published, starting in 1598 with Love's Labours Lost, the first to list Shakespeare as the author, and again demonstrating a familiarity with the aristocracy, with the dedication there on the slide. Between 1597 and 1603, 13 plays were published for the first time, including The Merchant of Venice, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Much Ado About Nothing. In 1603, Macbeth and King Lear are first performed, and an unauthorised version of Hamlet is published. And then in 1604, a very important year, the official version of Hamlet is published. And then all publication stops. Now remember the process from stage plays to literary, versified plays, which process normally takes 3 or 4 years. And yet we have this rapid fire production of the finished, genius product, and all variously having been performed by the Queen's own acting company. Now, 1604 is not only significant because of Hamlet and the cessation of publication, but for those plays not yet published, the consensus, the orthodox Stratfordian consensus, is that from about that time, the composition of the plays themselves starts to change. Because, it seems, Shakespeare packed up, left London, and moved back to Stratford-on-Avon to focus on other things. I'll get to that in a moment. But in terms of the works themselves and the watershed that was 1604, there is broad official agreement. Now, this just from one source. The longer we consider these plays that fall to be dated between the great tragedies about this time and The Tempest, the more we feel that something happened, confusion, laxities of construction, other men's botch work. That's Sir Arthur Quillercouch. So between 1604 and 1608, no plays are published, and the alteration of existing plays begins. Then in 1609, the sonnets. All 154 are published for the first time and dedicated to our ever-living poet, which phrase usually is reserved for those who have died. Excuse me. I have left up there some of Thomas Looney's points in relation to the sonnets. For completeness, also in 1609 were published Pericles, Troilus and Cressida, and King Lear. In 1622, Othello is published. And then in 1623, and the end of the timeline for our purposes, the first folio is published. It's published. Included were the full literary text of 20 plays not yet published, containing very many plays written before 1598. The first folio consolidated the watershed of 1604, rendering permanent the botchwork and contributions of other men. That's per Alfred Pollard in 1909. There are other aspects about the first folio that invite controversy, including the picture itself shown there on the screen. But for now, we will leave the first folio and the timeline of works attributed to Shakespeare and go to the author, or Shakespeare. Born in 1564 to illiterate parents, having a modest education, he makes a decent income trading grain, buys property, cannot be located when being chased for an unpaid tax bill, takes Philip Rogers to court for 2 shillings, makes various land purchases. In 1582, at age 28, he is forced to marry Anne Hathaway, 8 years older, and has 3 children. And in 1616, he dies, leaving to his wife his bed, and without any mention of any of his works. In 1616, when he dies, 16 of his plays were in print, with 20 yet to be published. Literarily, we have some questionable anecdotes from about 1591. In 1592, Robert Greene accuses him of plagiary, calling him an upstart crow. There are references to his having acted, though again with a lack of detail. While the precise dates are unclear, even tax collectors couldn't find him. His period in London spans from about 1592 to at least 1604, and then from 1605 he is referred to as William Shakespeare, gentleman of Stratford-on-Avon. In 1616, without any fanfare or obituary, he dies. That is it. And here we can remember the quotes from Dickens and Twain. A more complete quote from Twain, still slightly abridged, is as follows. So far as anybody actually knows and can prove, Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon never wrote a play in his life. He never wrote a letter to anybody in his life. He received only 1 letter during his life. So far as anyone knows and can prove, Shakespeare of Stratford wrote only 1 poem, engraved upon his tomb, and this is it. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. Beyond these details, we know not a thing about him. Biographers have built up course upon course of guesses, inferences, theories, conjectures, an Eiffel Tower of artificialities rising sky high from a very flat and very thin foundation of inconsequential facts, end quote. Now, after this, by Mark Twain, the very next year in 1910, records of a court case involving a dowry were discovered, where Shakespeare signed a deposition and about which historians became quite excited. Yet, even with that, no further light has been shed on the man or the author, William Shakespeare. In fact, the court document discovered in 1910 was in substance just another gap. And so here I have what we do have of Shakespeare, his signatures, 3 from his will, some contested, and 1 from the court case. Otherwise, there is simply no mention of him anywhere, including when he dies in 1616. And we can be emphatic about this. Every competent Shakespearean knows that records reveal neither incident, interview, conversation, correspondence, obituary notice, nor a single example of the 1,001 distinctive things that must inevitably have attended so prolonged and brilliant a publicity. That's from Thomas Looney. In substance, we have works without an author. And so with this scene, this problem, Thomas Looney sets about establishing a method to answer the question, if not Shakespeare, then who? And having analysed the works, Thomas Looney does a profiling exercise. As well as being a worldly aristocrat, Thomas Looney says the author was a matured man of recognised genius, of intense sensibility, a man apart, having a superior education. He was a talented poet and loose with money. And Thomas Looney, looking at the facts, very quickly settles upon Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, who at that stage in 1920 was not unknown, but not well known either. Having settled on Oxford, Thomas Looney undertakes various detailed comparisons of Oxford's few remaining poems with Shakespeare's works. And that literary analysis is lengthy and detailed, all pointing to Shakespeare and Oxford being one and the same. That detailed literary analysis I will leave and go to the man that Thomas Looney rediscovered, Edward de Vere. Of course, I'm referring to Edward de Vere and Oxford interchangeably. They're the same person. Now, in regards to Oxford, he seems to have rubbed people the wrong way, and which affected his legacy. But in any case, he lived a very full life. Born in 1550 to a family that had arrived with William the Conqueror in 1066, he is old aristocracy. His father dies when he is 12 and is made a ward of William Cecil or Burleigh. And this is important. Cecil is variously Treasurer and Secretary of State, but ultimately the behind-the-scenes mover and shaker, and which role he passes onto his sons Richard and Thomas. For 40 years, the biography of Cecil is almost indistinguishable from that of Elizabeth and from the history of England, and that's from Pollard's biography in 1911. By adopting Edward, Cecil had everything to gain, and he made sure that he did. So, summarising, Edward de Vere in his youth was awarded honorary degrees. He served in the military. He was made Lord at 21, Lord at age 21. He married Cecil's 14-year-old daughter Anne. Yes, that's right. His adoptive father became his father-in-law. He hatched a plan to break into prison and rescue a relative, but was unsuccessful. The relative was later executed. Edward de Vere left for Europe without permission, having to be hauled back. He took his frustrations out on Cecil by destroying and underselling his own estate. He travelled to Venice. He is thrown into the Tower of London for getting one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting pregnant. He is seriously wounded in a duel, after which rival gangs have street fights in London, seeing 2 men killed. He is a judge at the trial. He's one of the judges at the trial of Mary, Queen of Scots. He joins the fleet that defeated the Spanish Armada. And then, upon the death of his wife Anne, Cecil's daughter, he retires. We are at 1590. But significantly, and while all of this was happening, Edward de Vere is a poet and the director of his own acting company called Oxford's Boys, performing all over the country, including for the Queen, and it seems performing his own plays. Although of these works, we have only a few poems and no plays. By the mid-1580s, Oxford's reputation is established, and I have some quotes here. I'll try to get it right. In the rare devices of poetry have been and yet are most excellent skillful, among whom the Right Honourable Earl of Oxford may challenge to himself the title of the most excellent among the rest. That's from William Webb in 1586 in A Discourse of English Poetry. And then also, that for tragedy, the Lord of Buckhurst and Maester Edward Ferrys, and then ... the Earl of Oxford and Master Edwards of Her Majesty's Chapel for Comedy and Interlude. That's from The Art of English Poesy by George Putnam in 1589. In substance, what we have with Oxford is a renowned author, but no works. And then in the later half of the 1580s, things start to turn for Oxford, but we will just get the original timeline back up. In 1586, we see the trial of Mary, Queen of Scots, resulting in her execution, signalling the ascendancy of the others as far as Oxford was concerned. Broadly speaking, Oxford was in Mary's camp. Cecil, his adoptive father and father-in-law, was most definitely in the other. Then in 1587, Oxford's Boys disbands, and we have a distinct falling away of Oxford's dramatic activity. The next year in 1588, Oxford takes part in the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and before he can return, his wife Anne, Cecil's daughter, dies. Now theirs wasn't a smooth marriage with all kinds of intrigue, but in any case, upon her death, things were decidedly cooler between Cecil and Oxford. So with those events, in 1590, Oxford retires, and a couple of years later he remarries, bringing us back to our timeline from 1590, starting, coincidentally, with the writing of the sonnets. Yet, as you can now see, this is not the only timeline coincidence. Not only does Oxford's retirement at age 40 coincide with the start of the writing of the sonnets, it allows for various stage plays to be turned into literary ones, with 13 such plays being published from 1598. An otherwise extraordinary feat, unless of course the author is free to convert existing stage plays with which he is already familiar, and culminating in, of course, the publication of Hamlet. And then, not a decision to suddenly give it all up and go back to selling grain, allowing others to botch his unfinished works, but instead dying. Edward de Vere dies in June 1604, and the flurry of publication ceases. Then in 1609, Oxford estate settles, and in that same year, the sonnets are published, acknowledging our ever-living poet. But this isn't the only coincidence, because not only was Oxford a young lord of ancient lineage who lost his father, was brought to court by his mother, and there left as a royal ward, asked for military service and to be allowed to travel but is refused, goes away without permission, is married to a young woman with whom he had been brought up, after which there is matrimonial drama and intrigue. Not only was this Oxford, so also was this Bertram, the antagonist in All's Well That Ends Well, where Helena, a young woman of low birth, grows up in the court as a ward of a countess, falls in love with the countess's son Bertram, and overcomes numerous obstacles to marry him and finally win his love. On this, Thomas Looney says it would be difficult to find in English literature a closer analogy between a fictitious person and the detailed records of a living contemporary. The coincidences continue. There is Ovid's Metamorphoses, the collection of stories, fables published in the year 8 AD, including Icarus, Narcissus, Apollo and Daphne. Up there on the slides we have Bernini's work showing Daphne as she turns into a laurel tree. Ovid left deep traces in Shakespeare's work, including Arthur Golding's translation from Latin to English. That's per Sidney Lee, and also Sir Walter Raleigh. Now in 1562, Arthur Golding became the private Latin tutor of Edward de Vere. A few years later, Arthur Golding published his translation of Metamorphoses. Shakespeare had other influences. One mentioned already, being John Lyly, is described as the true inventor and introducer of dramatic style and the chief master of Shakespeare. There is no play before Lyly. He wrote 8, and immediately thereafter, England produced some hundreds. We've had that before. In comedy, Lyly is Shakespeare's only model. That's per Bond in 1902 in his work, The Complete Works of John Lyly. And then further, Lyly is the only dramatist whose work foreshadows the work of Shakespeare. That's per Sidney Lee. Where things get interesting is that Lyly dedicated his 1580 work, Euphues and His England, to his very good lord and master, Edward de Vere, which is understandable. John Lyly was the manager secretary of Edward de Vere's acting company, Oxford's Boys. Now, getting back to the sonnets, started in 1590 and published in 1609, of course, there were such things as sonnets well before that from Italy and then in England in slightly different form, although the groundwork for the truly Shakespearean sonnet was made ready by Samuel Daniel and Michael Drayton, who were both about 13 years old when Edward de Vere, by 1576, wrote Love Thy Choice, the first Shakespearean sonnet. It is the only sonnet in the collection of Edward de Vere's poems, and it is composed in the only form employed by Shakespeare. I've set out the form on the slide. The first Shakespearean sonnet was by Edward de Vere, at least 14 years before Shakespeare is understood to have begun writing his sonnets, and when those who laid the groundwork for the Shakespearean sonnets were mere boys. Now these sonnets, Shakespeare's I mean, there are 154 in total, and the first 17 are known as the Procreation sonnets. because they urge a young nobleman known as the fair youth to marry and have children. Which has what to do with this young man? Well, this man is Southampton, the one and the same Earl to whom Venus and Adonis was dedicated in 1593. There is a lot to be said about the Earl of Southampton, including that in 1590 he was being pressured to marry the daughter of Edward de Vere. And then we come to Hamlet, whose first line is, "Who's there?" In Hamlet, it has been said that the author has discovered too much of himself, a philosopher, poet, critic, and courtier, lover and cynic, the extremes that only Shakespeare's intellect could cover. That's per Frank Harris in The Man Shakespeare, published in 1909. 40 years earlier, George Russell French observed that Polonius represents none other than William Cecil. George Russell French in 1869 then makes the next logical step, equating Polonius' son Laertes with William's real-life son, Richard Cecil. He rounds it off by concluding that Laertes' sister Ophelia is Richard Cecil's real-life sister, Anne. George Russell French then mentions a few other connections, including that Anne Cecil was married to Edward de Vere, though makes no connection to Hamlet. Hamlet the character, I mean. This shows how far Edward de Vere had fallen into obscurity and the worth of Thomas Looney's investigation in re-identifying him. When Anne Cecil died, Edward de Vere was away fighting the Spanish Armada. When Ophelia died, Hamlet was away negotiating with pirates his own release. As well as these coincidences, we also have a thematic relationship between the man Oxford and the works generally. For our theory, the relationship between Edward de Vere and William Cecil is key. The clash of old feudalism with the burgeoning individualistic work ethic and statecraft of which Cecil was the prototype, attributes that Shakespeare reserved for his villains. Oxford, imbued with the best ideals of feudalism, with their conceptions of duty, social fidelity and devotion, was completely out of touch with the ascendant party. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots, followed by the death of his wife Anne, had him on the outer. With his acting troupe disbanded, in 1590 Oxford retires. And the sonnets begin, where the author exhorts a noble to marry and laments the loss of his own good name. A few years later, rapid-fire publication of 13 full literary plays begins, before stopping abruptly. The last play is the official version of Hamlet, where Shakespeare discovers too much of himself. Edward de Vere's queen is dead. The others, the Poloniuses and Iagos, have gained the ascendancy. In 1604, Oxford is diminished and he is dying. Also in 1604, fearing the death of his memory, Hamlet asks of his friend Horatio a favour, to tell his story. The rest is silence. And so it was for Edward de Vere. 19 years later, and with no involvement from the family of the man from Stratford, the first folio is published, comprising mostly, thus far, unpublished works. This folio was prefaced by the famous poet Ben Jonson, who also penned the dedicatory poem titled "To the Memory of My Beloved." There is plenty to be said about Ben Jonson, but for now, to put it simply, he was not insignificant. In the preface you can see there, Ben Jonson exhorts the reader, so as to know the author, not to look to the picture immediately opposite, but rather to his book. This is where you will find the author, says Ben Jonson. Here Ben Jonson is referring to the inadequacy of a two-dimensional picture to show the multi-dimensional genius of the author, of his beloved. Yet despite what Ben Jonson tells us, nothing of the actual man from Stratford can be gleaned from the body of works he is meant to have left behind. Thomas Looney, however, takes Ben Jonson's advice. He looks to his book and straight away finds Edward de Vere. But apart from correctly attributing the works, why does any of this matter? Well, the official story is that having established his genius, in 1604 the man from Stratford retires to land, houses, malt and money, leaving his masterpieces to be botched by strangers. 12 years later, he dies totally disassociated from everything that made him famous. Implicit in the official Stratfordian view is the indifference to its own subject matter, and which raises, why should we care about Shakespeare when Shakespeare didn't care about Shakespeare? Thomas Looney's position, the Oxfordian position, resolves this. The only thing that stopped Edward de Vere from finishing his works was death itself, and very much unlike the man from Stratford, in these works we can see the man, which now have their author. The works we know as Shakespeare's are in substance without an author. Quite separately, and overlooked for centuries, Edward de Vere is a renowned author without any works. Putting these two together, as Thomas Looney has done, we have more than coincidence. We have answers to both questions. Who wrote the plays? And where are Oxford's works? The Oxfordian position does not just elevate Edward de Vere, it elevates, or restores rather, art and literature to their rightful place, an endeavour to be put above all else. I won't make the Stratfordians' argument for them, although my impression is that they insist simply because it's always been that way. They have arguments like The Tempest and the partial manuscript of a work concerning Thomas More. I should say that Thomas Looney dedicates an entire appendix dealing with The Tempest, which he says is a wholly un-Shakespearean play. But it seems to me that the Stratfordian position is to go from one extreme of insisting on what is merely possible to the other extreme of denying anything else as utterly impossible, whereas the Oxfordian is in the middle, concerned with what is probable, that is, a noble, a genius, a playwright, writing about his own life and circumstances where he couldn't use his own name. So, if I have piqued your interest, then I recommend obtaining a copy of Shakespeare Identified, but also, and what I found very helpful, is Shakespeare Revealed, a collection of correspondence and articles published in the aftermath of Shakespeare Identified, and which develops Thomas Looney's various arguments. Otherwise, and if Thomas Looney has convinced you, well, here he is. The author of the sonnets of Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, The Merchant of Venice, of Romeo and Juliet, Much Ado About Nothing, and of course, Hamlet. Here is Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. We actually have a description of the man from a 1922 publication, Queen Elizabeth's Maids of Honour, which is as follows. Edward de Vere, the erratic young Earl of Oxford, professed no particular regard for any of the ladies, nearly all of whom were wildly in love with him. Being one of the Queen's wards, he had been brought up at court, where he early distinguished himself in shooting, dancing, riding, and many other accomplishments, while he had a way with the ladies that seemingly none of them could resist. To male eyes, he appeared less attractive, and Gabrielle Harvey described him unflatteringly. Straight to the back like a shirt, and close to the breech like a diveling, a little apish hat couched fast to the pate like an oyster. French cambric ruffs, deep with a witness, starched to the purpose. Delicate in speech, quaint in array, conceited in all points. In courtly guiles, a passing singular odd man. End quote. Excuse me. Anyway, I will leave the last words to Thomas Looney, who, writing shortly after the end of what was then called the Great War, said, "More than ever in the coming years we shall need the spirit of Shakespeare to assist in the work of holding the politician and the materialist to their secondary position, speaking no longer from behind a mask or from under a pseudonym, but in his own honoured name, Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, will ever call mankind to the worship of truth, reality, the infinite wonder of human nature, and the eternal greatness of man."